I'm Kiran Millwood Hargrave, author of The Mercies, which is being released in Italy later this year. Of course, I was meant to be at your wonderful festival in Padua, where I have never been, but alas, coronavirus had other ideas. But it's lovely to be able, through the magic of technology, to talk to you a bit about The Mercies. Now, I'm just going to talk for about 10 minutes about my ideas for the book. I may wave around this version, which is the British version. Your cover is different, so don't get confused. So The Mercies first came to me as an idea through a work of art. I am a great fan of the work of the artist Louise Bourgeois, and she creates the most extraordinary large-scale installations that sort of mediate on the role of women and domesticity and desire. And I saw on BBC one day this image of her final major installation, and it was of this metal chair, and the metal chair was sort of encased in a cage of smoked glass, and it was surrounded by these bronze mirrors, and in the centre of the chair was a flame, and it was just an incredibly striking, threatening piece of art, and I was determined to go and see it for myself in person. So I thought, oh, where is it? It must be in one of the great centres of art. It must be in Rome or Paris or London. But unfortunately, it was on a tiny Arctic Circle island, as far north enough to be in the Arctic Circle, further east than Istanbul, at the outermost edges of Norway. And it was just a very striking moment, actually, to sort of realise what an inaccessible place it was in. And it made me instantly curious about why this incredible artist had put a piece of work that would take a full day for anyone on mainland Europe to reach. And the answer was that it formed part of a memorial to 91 men and women who had been burned on the spot where the chair now stands in the 1600s. In the world's in that part of the world's largest witch trials. So Scandinavia might not be somewhere that you necessarily think of as having vicious witch hunts, but 91 men and women were burned on this tiny Arctic Circle island. So of course I take my research incredibly seriously, and I went to Wikipedia and I googled the Vardø witch trials, and what came back was a very short article. There was a paragraph on the witch trials themselves and on the installation, and then there was also a paragraph about the 1617 storm. So the trials began in 1620, but 3 years before there had been this storm that eyewitnesses said occurred so suddenly it was as if it was loosened from a bag, it was as if it was conjured. And I got chills when I read that word conjured, because I realised that the women who were then burned in the trials 3 years later were likely the same women who had 3 years earlier watched 40 of their menfolk drown in this unnatural seeming storm. So I became instantly curious about what happened in those 3 years. And I tried to find a book, a novel. I always prefer to get my history in novels about this incredible occurrence, but there wasn't one. And, you know, it was as though it was handed to me on a plate, this incredible structure of this storm in 1617 and these vicious witch hunts in 1620. And nothing in between. No research, no history book, no novel. So I thought, I have to be the one to write this novel, and that is what became The Mercies. And it opens with this image of the storm. It opens with my main character, Marin, watching as her brother and her fiancé and her father row out for their Christmas Eve catch, and unfortunately they don't come back. And I think I'd read a lot of witch trial books, so I'd read a lot of books that felt like they almost revelled in the gruesome spectacle that were witch hunts. And I was more interested in writing a book about how people lived, you know, how did they exist in these incredibly harsh environments, especially with their breadwinners gone, because of course there was no feminism in the 1600s, and women very much had their place, and that was in the home with the domestic, and they were very much not equipped to deal with fending for themselves, especially in such a harsh environment where for 3 months of the year the sun doesn't rise, and for another 2 months it doesn't set. And I actually visited Vardø in Norway twice. Once in winter when the sun doesn't rise, and the cold was so brutal that I couldn't remove my glove for more than a moment, lest my fingers become completely useless. And I visited again in summer when the sun didn't set. And if you've ever been in those conditions, you'll know it sets up an incredible restlessness inside you. It takes your sleep, it takes your peace to not be able to sleep, and to exist in this endless light is actually almost as strange as existing in endless darkness. So it really helped me to gain an understanding of these women who had existed at the edges of the world and who had to fend for themselves. So this is my debut novel for adults, and I am a children's author as well. My debut, The Girl of Ink and Stars, has been released in Italy in translation, and I've always been interested in islands, in this idea of isolation and a self-contained society that doesn't contend with the traditional issues of borders, but rather with its own imperialist sense. And I very much use that word with the knowledge of where I live in Great Britain, in England in particular, and how much the sensibility of the UK is tied up in the idea that we're an island nation. And we have seen the great harm that has done to our relationships with our friends in Europe. I am very much against Brexit, horrible word, and believe that community is an incredibly important thing, and that is something that I really explore in both my children's books and have carried forward into the Mercies, is the idea of how when you allow otherness and allow a narrative of us versus them, that's when true danger begins to creep in, because you set up not only a difference, an opposition, but you also set up a fear, because you fear what you cannot understand. And if you do not make efforts to understand, then you're only going to become more afraid. So the Mercies really is about how this island becomes a site for suspicion, and a site where neighbour turns on neighbour, and there is this narrative set up of us versus them, and you see the characters be caught up in this awful struggle for power. So I am going to close out by talking about what the Mercies taught me, because it is my first adult novel, and it taught me incredible lessons about constructing a novel, about entering a character through the body, because I think in children's literature characters show you who they are through action, whereas I think in adult literature you're allowed to sit within a body and see the world through them. And Sebald said, writing is about discovering things hitherto unseen, otherwise there's no point to the process. And I lived that when I wrote this book. I wrote it incredibly fast. I was discovering everything about the history and the place as I went along. And ultimately the Mercies has taught me to be more compassionate and to not allow my misunderstanding of other people's motives to allow me to hate them, because I think hate actually makes you weak, it doesn't make you strong, and that compassion is a far more important trait when it comes to moving forward and fixing our world's problems. So the Mercies is, it's is quite bleak, it's quite difficult, it's quite dark, but it's also full of light, full of love, full of hope. And I think that those are my wishes for the hearts, especially of my readers, is that they will leave this book feeling like they have opened their minds a bit and have learned that maybe compassion is a far stronger trait than hatred. Thank you very much for listening, and I wish I was there, and certainly wish I wasn't here in locked down UK, but I wish you all the best, health and happiness to you, and thank you very much.